Good morning. Welcome to the 11th meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure that they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? I've received apologies from Stuart McMillan and Alec Rowley for this meeting. We're joined by Stuart Stevenson, who is substituting for Mr Macmillan. You're more than welcome, Stuart. Do members have any declarations they wish to make in advance of the session this morning? No, thank you. Agenda item 1 is our first oral evidence session on our inquiry into the flexibility and autonomy of local government in Scotland. The written submissions we have received as part of this inquiry have been published on our website. During the first week of the Easter recess, Anne McTaggart, Mark MacDonald and I undertook a 3-day fact-finding visit to Germany, Denmark and Sweden to examine how local government operates in those countries. A report of this visit will form part of our inquiry report in due course. Can I thank the clerks for putting together that trip? It was an exceptional programme, and I'd also like to thank our hosts in all 3 countries who welcomed us and provided us with lots and lots of information. Turning to the session today, we have 2 panels of witnesses this morning. Our first panel are joining us live from Mariehamn in Holland via conference link and represent the Parliament of Holland. We need to conclude this session within the hour, as our colleagues in Holland have a plenary session to attend after they give evidence to us. Can I first of all welcome the members from Holland to this. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves for the record? I'm Kevin Stewart, Chair of the committee, and we're most grateful to hear from you this morning. So if you could maybe tell us who you are, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Nice to hear from you. My name is Harry Jansson. I'm a member of the Parliament here on the Åland Islands. Been a member since 2007. I am a member also of our Constitutional Committee for Constitutional Affairs, as it's said in our Act of Autonomy. And I'm also a member in the joint committee with Finland for we are developing a new autonomy system. Thank you.
Good morning, Scottish Fellows. My name is Axel Johnson, and I'm as well a member of the Constitutional Committee and the committee negotiating on the new Autonomy Act, as well as my colleague Harry Jansson. And I'm also the party leader of the Åland Islands SNP, the Independence Party. So it's very interesting to discuss with you these very, very important issues.
Thank you very much.
And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Susanne Eriksson. I'm the Secretary General of the Parliament.
Thank you very much. I'm well aware that sometimes I speak rather quickly. If I start doing that, then just let me know. It's the northeast of Scotland. Unfortunately, we talk very fast sometimes. I understand that Ms. Eriksson, you're going to start off by giving us a brief overview of the autonomy that exists in Holland.
Yes, Chairman. I have understood that you have got the Act on Autonomy of the Åland Islands, and I would like to start with a short introduction of that, because this is the really foundation of the autonomy of Åland. The Act itself is the most complicated law in the whole of Finland, because it is passed by the Parliament in Helsinki. And in addition to that, there is a need of consent of the Åland Parliament. And since this act is dividing the power between Åland and Finland, this is a very, very safe system, but not very easy to make any amendments. And it means that the power division could never be changed without an agreement between the 2 parliaments. This power division is described in the Autonomy Act in more or less 2 articles. In Article 18, you find all the fields of competence of Åland. And what is mentioned in this Article 18 is what belong to Åland concerning legislative power, and also the administration on these fields belong to Åland. And you may say that Finland more or less has no say on those fields. And if you describe them briefly, I should say that it's a matter of that everything that is belonging to the internal affairs of the Åland Islands belong to the Parliament of Åland. This means, for instance, education, social and health care, culture, environmental protection within the Åland Islands, and traffic in the Åland Islands, postal service, radio, television, and also matters concerning municipalities. This means that the rules concerning altogether 16 municipalities on Åland belong to the Åland Parliament, that has the power to decide how many municipalities there should be on Åland, and also what power should be transferred to these municipalities. We have quite a lot of them, 16 compared to especially Sweden and also the rest of Finland. But on the other hand, the municipalities on the Åland Islands, according to our acts or laws, do not have exactly as much power as the municipalities on the mainland, as we say, because healthcare and education for pupils that are between 16 and 18 years old belong on Åland to the government of Åland instead of to the municipalities. The municipality taxation, laws about the municipality taxation also belong to our parliament, and that's the only taxation we still have, and you will hear more about that later on. In Article 27 of this Act on Autonomy, you find all the competences that belong to the Parliament of Finland. And more or less you could say this is the rest that I never mentioned concerning the power of Åland. And what also belongs to Finland is the competence of foreign affairs. But this does not mean that we are out of all influence concerning international treaties, because if and when Finland goes into an international treaty that has an effect on our field of competence, then there is a need of the consent of the Åland Parliament if that treaty should be valid on the Åland Islands too. This happens about 20-30 times a year, that the President of Finland brings over through the governor that has a special position in our autonomy system as a person in between the state and the Åland authorities. Through the governor, the president brings over these international treaties to the parliament, and the parliament gives its consent more or less like putting a rubber stamp on it or very easily and with no complications. But when Finland started to negotiate concerning from the beginning EEA treaty, later on EC and EU membership, this Article 59 in the Autonomy Act really put Åland into a negotiating position. That led to that Åland politicians decided that Åland should join Finland into the EU, but on certain conditions that are taken into a certain protocol within the accession treaty between Finland and the other member states. And this protocol is telling that Åland is to be a so-called third country when it comes to indirect taxes. This was the technical solution that was chosen to make it possible to go on with tax-free selling on the ferry boats in traffic between Åland and Sweden and Finland. Because this is a society that is to a very great extent is depending on shipping, not on fishing but or tourism, but on shipping actually. So and we already then knew that the tax-free selling in the internal traffic within the EU should disappear in 1999. So that's why we needed that. And also, as important is that this protocol on the Åland Islands in the accession treaty says that Åland should have possibilities to go on with our special rules that are very close to the autonomy. For instance, to demand what is called the right of domicile of those who want to buy land and establish on Åland. And the right of domicile you get either when you were born Ålander, or if you move into Åland, you get it after 5 years of residence, which is quite a long time.
Very much.
So I think I'll stop there.
I understand that Mr. Janssen is going to talk about some of the financial powers of Åland. Please, sir.
Thank you, sir. We are now facing a very weak position in the Åland system, at least from our political point of view, since the main power connected to taxation is still vested in the powers of government and parliament in Helsinki. The system is quite complicated since the Finnish state collects all taxes here on the islands. What we can do is to decide the level on the municipality taxation. That means that in our own law vad säger man från lagtinget?
Law passed the Åland.
Yes, a law passed by our own parliament decides the conditions for the municipalities to follow when they decide on the percentage of the tax. But otherwise, the only power of taxation is that we can also levy an additional tax is here on the islands. But you understand that would just be an extra burden for our population and for the companies and so on. So our financial management is mainly directed from Helsinki, because the taxes that the Finnish state collects here, they go into the Finnish state budget, you can put it very simply, and then we get a repayment, as you may call it, annually to cover our expenses. This is a field that we are now trying to change, and I think my colleague Axel will talk more about that, because we don't no longer accept that we don't have any powers really to have an impact on our economical society. Otherwise, everything here is governed in detail by our own government, because we have the freedom to administer our budget. That might sound to you a bit surprising that I say that would be a progress, but actually before 1993, the Finnish state, after a budget year has been completed, they examined every penny that was used here on the islands to see if we have used it in the same way as the Finnish state has done. So there was a system based on supervision by every meaning. So that's why we have for a few years been pleased just to have this budgetary freedom, but no longer. That's why we're now trying to achieve some new goals when it comes to economical power. In the beginning, perhaps, if you allow, Mr. Chairman, you'd like to, just as a general remark, because it's very interesting to see that you're now trying to develop an internal Scottish system of autonomy, or what you will call it, local government. You have also, as I'm sure you're quite sure that you're aware of this, but you always have to take in consideration when looking at other existing models that everyone has its unique background. And you know, the Åland solution is based on a conflict where we wanted to be a part of Sweden, a choice that the Finns couldn't accept. So what we have today is more than 90 years of experience of autonomy, but the system is still not a perfect one. So you will find in our system some very special, shall we say, conditions that you don't want to adapt in your own system. But I think you will be able to find them quite easily when you take a closer look. Finally, I've been to the Shetland Islands myself a few years ago, taking part in the seminar where they started discussing the same matter as you now are dealing with today. And also a colleague of mine from the Centre Party, which I'm the leader of here on the Åland Islands, Mr. Pettersson, he took a part in a similar seminar the last year, representing also the Åland Parliament. So we are happy to be able to assist you in any way you want to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Janssen. And if now we could turn to Mr. Jonsson, who I believe is going to talk about the ongoing development of autonomy. Mr. Jonsson, please.
Thank you very much. And as my colleague Harry Janssen mentioned, the autonomy system we live with today is not a perfect one. And that's, of course, why we're working on developing it. And the basis for our demands from Åland Islands is that we want a more flexible system. As Ms. Eriksson told you, we have a secure autonomy, but the flexibility in the system is very, very limited. Since every time we want to change the Autonomy Act, it has to be passed by two parliaments after an election, after elections. So it's a very, very complicated process to change the Autonomy Acts and to get more competence areas and powers to the Åland Parliament. And this, in the long term, has led to that our autonomy is underdeveloped, and our competence powers are very limited compared to other European autonomies and in an international perspective. And that's kind of the basis for because why we are trying to develop our autonomy. When we look at Scotland, for instance, we see that you have made progress the last 20 years, but in Åland Islands in 20 years, more or less nothing has changed. And then we joined the European Union in 1995. So a lot of things around us has changed, but the Autonomy Act is more or less the same as 20 years ago. And that's a growing problem when the outside world changes faster and faster. So we want a more flexible system to be able to meet the challenges of tomorrow, challenges that we don't, all of them we don't know today what they look like. And but some we can see already today as the economical challenge that we definitely are seeing this very day, when Finland is doing economically quite bad, if you put it straightforward, and we get a percentage of the Finnish state budget, but the Åland economy and the Åland industry the last years has done quite well, but since the Finnish economy is doing very, very bad, we don't get. We have to cut in our public expenses because our incomes are decreasing, despite our economy as a whole is doing okay, and that's a problem to explain to the common Åland Islanders why this situation, why it should be so, and a lot of people are questioning this system. Because when Finland are doing economically good, we get an okay amount of money, but this is probably the first time we've seen bad economical times in Finland during a longer period, and then we start to see that it's affecting the Åland society in a very strange way, thanks to the link to the Finnish economy, and that it's so strong in our budgetary system. And the very core of the autonomy, as mentioned before, is the language protection. And when Åland wanted to be a part of Sweden in 1921, the decision in the League of Nations could only be justified in international law, since Finland at the time was a bilingual country, a bilingual state with both Swedish and Finnish on a quite equal level. And if you compare it to the situation of today, in the constitution, Finland is still a bilingual country, and in theory, but in practice, a lot of things has changed since 1921, and this means a lot of problems, of course, for the inhabitants of Åland Islands, and since this is the very core as well in the autonomy, it's a very good argument for us to put forward in the negotiations for a new Autonomy Act, because when we have to speak with Finnish authorities and they can't answer us in Swedish, although we have the right to get to communicate with them in Swedish, it's a great problem for our inhabitants, and therefore we want a more flexible system also, not only for the economy but for the language situation, to be able to create our own authorities, to be able to create systems where the Åland inhabitants can get their public service in Swedish, and it's of course important also in a historical perspective and for the autonomy as a whole. So at the moment we have started last year in November negotiations in a committee with both Finnish parliamentarians and members of the parliament from Åland Islands, and we are negotiating on which kind of system we want to have from 1922 and further on, since the Autonomy Act has to be changed by two parliaments, as mentioned, with an election in between. So that's why we aim for a changed Autonomy Act starting from 1922. So we are negotiating, and we are in very central part of the negotiations at the moment, where we are like making the most important parts of the new autonomy system at the moment, and have very hard negotiations on that topics. And if you summarize what we are aiming for in Åland Islands and our demands, it's that we want the possibility to take over new powers with a decision made by the Åland Parliament, without involving the Finnish Parliament. We want to move away from today's system where Finland, the Finnish Parliament, has the last word, so to say, about moving a competence area from Finland to Åland. We want to be able to take this competence by ourselves, and but we don't demand it for all competence areas, but we demand it for all areas except the very core of the sovereignty, such as security and defense policy, currency and monetary policy, Supreme Court, and foreign affairs. And we want a full possibility to create a working tax autonomy, because we mean that an autonomy without tax competence is not really an autonomy if you look at it from an international perspective. And but we also want the possibility to make our own international agreement on topics within our competence areas. Today we can agree on international treaties or agreements that Finland make with other states, but we also want to make our own international agreements in the new system. So we want a flexible system where we by ourselves can take over powers to the Åland Parliament to meet the challenges of tomorrow. And as I mentioned before, my party is working for full independence, but when we are waiting for the other parties to realize that we should decide upon our own future, we are working together with them to develop the autonomy, at least in the right direction. But this is, in short, what challenges and our solutions for the future, what they look like today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jonsson. I'm now going to take questions from colleagues for you. Can I start off with Anne McTaggart, please?
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, panel, and welcome. And thank you very much for your extremely informative discussion there. We have, I was one of the party that had went out to Germany, Denmark and Sweden last week or 2 weeks ago. It seems now, it seems pretty far away. But we had, one of the questions that we asked whilst we were there was about the formal procedures of dealing with any grievances. Do you have any formal procedures if dealing with grievances, you know, is there a formal process?
Who wants to answer that?
The word grievances, could you explain that to us? It's a bit unfamiliar to us, grievances.
Any tensions, if there are any arguments, any disagreements, how are they dealt with?
Aha, between the Finnish state and Åland?
Yes, please.
Okay, yes. We have, since the very beginning of the autonomy, it was a special body was organized. It's the so-called Åland Delegation. You can say that it's a body that is under, shall we say, the influence of the president, but is very independent when it comes to dealing with the Ålandic matters. For instance, if we need some extra grant, we have a special investment, a very big one we have to face, then we can apply for a special grant from Finland. And this body is so strong that it can decide on its own that Åland would have an extra sum of money. So and that body also has the power to control the laws that are passed by our parliament. So this body, the Åland Delegation, has is the first level of
controlling.
Yeah, controlling when it comes to have we used our authority, our competence in the right way. So it's a very strong body. Can we call it an arbitrary one? Yes, because it has representatives both from Åland and from Finland.
And you want to add something?
And maybe, yes, please. This is a very legalistic system, so it means that the Åland delegation and then after that the Supreme Court and at last the President of Finland could put his veto against an Åland law, but only if we are stepping into the field of competence of Finland, not because of that the Parliament has passed a law that you don't, from political point of view, like in Finland. It's only from a strict legal point of view that the veto could be putted. This Åland delegation is in the chapter 8 of this autonomy and in the Autonomy Act, and you may read more there. And in chapter 7 there is an explanation of this lump sum that the gentleman here talked about earlier that we are getting back from Finland.
Thank you.
Perhaps if you allow one more general remark, if you create a system where you will transfer some sort of decision-making, call it powers, whatever, to a local government and also a local parliament, council, whatever, then it's very important that you have this kind of independent body that can decide when conflict is on the table, and there will be conflict between the state and the local government, that's for sure.
Thank you. I think that's been very useful. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm looking at Section 59A of your legislation that governs your operation, and that particularly relates to the preparation of national positions that are taken to the European Union, the European Council. And the provision, and it says, if the positions of Holland and the state cannot be harmonised in accordance with this act in a matter falling within the powers of Holland, the position of Holland shall be, on the request of the government of Holland, be declared when the positions of Finland are presented in the institutions of the European Union. I just hoped you might be able to indicate how often that happens so that I can see, or is the fact of the provision being in the legislation sufficient to ensure it happens rarely?
Yes, that last remark was very elegantly put by you, sir, because that's how it functions. Before we had this in our Act of Autonomy, we had difficulties, but after we managed to have this alteration, amendment of the law, then it's very rare that these kinds of problems arises. And also, if you have a look at on the paragraph, the section called dealing with the Court of Justice in Strasbourg, before we ever managed to have this amendment that we are able to have a defense before the court, we had problems because in some cases the Finnish state more or less refused to defend the islands in the court. So we felt quite defenseless at that time. So this has been a very important chapter for us since we entered the European Union.
Can I just supplement briefly that, and I think it would be very brief. Do you have the right of appearance as part of the Finnish delegation, enabling you to speak directly at council meetings of one sort or another in Europe?
Yes, we have that right, but still we are dependent on the Finnish chairman, that's the minister normally that is in charge of the Finnish delegation, that he or her decides that the Åland representative may speak. So we are still dependent on that kind of kindness, more or less, you can put it. But there have been Ålandic ministers taking the floor at minister level, yes.
Not very often.
Not very often.
Thank you. Cameron Buchanan, please.
Good morning. I've been to Mariehamn, and I noticed that Swedish seemed to be the main language spoken there, rather than Finnish. And it also, we went there because the boats were duty-free, which goes from Sweden to Finland. If you have this agreement for independence, will that duty-free, because it seems to be a major tourist factor for you, will that duty-free arrangement stop?
Out of sync with our inquiry, but if you want to answer, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, well, as we see it, our relationship to the European Union doesn't change with the independence. So also the Åland Protocol is still the same, and we are outside the tax union. So nothing changes for the tax-free traffics.
Okay. Cameron?
Mr. Johnson thinks so.
May I please perhaps add that it's a bit more complicated than that, because if Åland would be an independent state, then our position towards the European Union would have to be renegotiated, and also this protocol would be scrutinized by the Commission and by all members of the union.
Okay, Mr. Buchanan.
Is Swedish still the main language spoken in Åland, or Finnish?
Yes,
That's right.
I should have mentioned actually that Åland is the only unilingual part of Finland, unilingual Swedish. And there is also a central chapter of this Autonomy Act telling how Finland should deal with Åland. Finnish authorities should deal with Åland authorities in Swedish. But as Mr. Johnson said, in practice, the Swedish spoken in the rest of Finland is more or less becoming a private language, talked in private life. But the authorities and companies are more and more getting Finnish speaking. So it will be harder for Finland to fulfill its obligations according to the Act that the authorities should communicate with us in Swedish.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning. I've been looking at figures around the number of businesses that are located in Åland versus set that against the island communities in Scotland. I note that the population of Åland is very similar to the Western Isles in Scotland, yet there are almost double the number of businesses located within Åland compared to those located within the Western Isles. Is that because you are able to take specific economic development decisions within Åland as part of your autonomy? And are there specific policies you have put in place to try and grow the number of businesses that are located on Åland Islands?
Even though we don't have a full tax competence, we have powers of the industrial policy. So we have some instruments to improve for our businesses. But you can describe the businesses on Åland Islands. Why we have so many is we have so many small family businesses. With I think 90% of the businesses has 1 to 4 employees or non-employees. They have a one-person company. So we have a lot of small companies, and that's why we have a great number of companies, but most of them are very small.
But today you might put it like this: we are still able to support different kind of businesses, but the framework is the programs that are made in connection with the European Union. So that governs everything in detail. And that's, of course, a lesson for you to bear in mind that if you try to enhance any kind of local government, then you have to have the EU question always in your mind, that how will this affect the life as a member of the European Union. And, of course, there's also the question of state aid, how the Commission in Brussels will act if you started to support any kind of government or business that is not included in one of the programs accepted by the Commission.
And Åland is also situated in a very strong economical area between Stockholm, the southwest of Finland, Helsinki. So, and we are taking advantage of this, and this strong economic area has also formed a spirit of entrepreneurship on the Åland Islands through many years.
And maybe the most important things, and the most important thing for our strong economy is actually the tax. The tax extension, from that we are outside the European Union, and that's not only for the ferry and the tax-free traffic, but the tax-free traffic gives our small companies cheap transportation between Sweden and Finland as well. And without that transportation, we probably couldn't have such many companies as well. So it's not important only for the shipping industry. It's very important also for the economy as a whole.
I understand that. I understand that the Åland Islands have significant renewable energy potential, and that is something which they share with the islands of Scotland as well, and the island communities of Scotland. I wondered how renewable energy projects were being developed in Åland, and whether the policies around that were exclusively in the competence of the Åland Islands, or whether you had to work closely with the Finnish government to develop these projects.
This special branch is in the total control of the Åland Parliament, the Åland government. The problem is now that due to the low energy prices, our windmill companies are having quite a problematic daily life, and it's not that easy for our parliament to support the companies now in this very difficult period. Just 2 years ago, we had 25% of the total energy production coming from our windmills. So we were very happy to see a progress in that field. But now we are down in 20%, and that's due to the fact that we can't support the companies now when they're having quite severe problems. And we are trying to create a cooperation with Finland in this field, but so far they have been very reluctant to have the Ålandic windmill producers in their own very generous system of supporting renewable energy.
When you say windmill producers, are turbines actually being built in Åland? Is that what you're saying? Are windmills actually being manufactured in Åland?
No. I'm afraid not. Just the
producing electricity.
Yes.
It's a subsidy for electricity production that you're having a problem with, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. John Wilson, please.
Good morning. I'd like to take you back to taxation issues. Mr. Johnson indicated that there were difficulties in really the redistribution of the tax raised in Åland from Helsinki. Does all the national tax go into Helsinki, and then how is that then redistributed to Åland?
It's said in the Act that 0.45% of the incomes of Finland should go back to the Åland Islands. It doesn't matter how much we are paying to Finland, but it's fixed in this autonomy. It's in Article 47. You find it in the Act. So that's why Mr. Johnson said that even if the economy is running very well on the Åland Islands, we don't get more money back, but we depend on the economy in Finland.
So, just for clarification, you depend on Finland then deciding how much money Åland should get as a budget for the Åland Islands?
No, it's said in the Autonomy Act, 0.45% of the income in the Finnish budget. But we depend on how big the Finnish budget is then.
But the Act is a fixed amount no matter how much Åland contributes in tax take to Finland.
Yes, that's right.
That the Act, and there has not been any attempt to change that section in the Act, or does Finland resist changing that section in the Act?
That's right.
Yes. But then there is a parallel system saying that when we produce more than 0.5% of the Finnish income when it comes to state and state taxation, you might call it, direct taxation, then we receive this excess. If we are having more than 0.5, then we get the extra money back to the Åland Islands. So it's a tax retribution, and it's been very important to us because since the present Autonomy Act came into force 1993, we have been able to receive this kind of extra money every year because our business has done better than the Finnish in average. So it's been a very, very important source of income, and it's been also, shall we say, encouraging for our government to take action that has been good for the business.
And good for Finland as well. Could I go back to the issue about local taxation and the municipalities you mentioned earlier? Municipalities have their own tax-raising powers. How much can municipalities raise at a local level?
There are no limits in the law, so they can raise 10, 15, 20 or 30% of the income. So what the Parliament does, we only pass a law saying that the special terms for the municipal decision. That is because, for example, when you are traveling here on the island to and from your work, you're able to have a avdrag. Discount. Can you call it discount? You're able to take it off your taxation. I don't know the proper word when it turns. But at least we have those kind of discount and the inhabitants are allowed to make. So we decide, the Parliament decide what kind of benefits the population should have in a municipality. But the municipality, the council decides the level. So here on the islands, there are one community municipality that the tax rate is 16.5, and the highest here on the islands is another smaller one having 19.5% in municipal tax.
There is a small competition.
Yep. In relation to the redistribution of the money that the Åland Parliament receives from Finland, how much of that funding received from Finland goes from the Parliament to the municipalities?
If we have, let's say, we have an Åland budget comprising about 340 million something, and we transfer around 35 million euros every year to the municipalities.
Right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Just a brief question on the back of that. I'm looking at section 50 of your legislation, which is, gives you the power to issue bonds and take out other loans. And I just wondered to what extent you've exercised that power and how useful that is to you.
We have never used this right to finance our system with bonds, and at this very moment we are quite happy to state that we don't have any loans, so we are not in debt, the government of Åland, and that's thanks to, shall we say, a more responsible policy during the days when our islands went very well economically, because we were able then to save in a special fund that we've been using now when we have had this bad time since 2008.
How much is in your special fund? You receive 340 million euros a year. How much is in your special fund?
It was 50 million, but we've used it now. The last money went. No. The fund was 50 million. The very fund, yes. But then we have extra money, likvida medel.
Cannon, please.
In your lagting at the Parliament, what influence does the Finnish MP have who comes over to represent Finland's interest, and vice versa? Do you have somebody from Åland who goes to the Finnish Parliament?
Yes, we do, also according to the Act. But the person in the Åland member in the Finnish Parliament represent the Åland voters in matters that are not belonging to the field of the Åland autonomy. So that's our democratic way of having influence on those laws passed by the Parliament of Finland that also are valid on the Åland Islands. But on the field of the autonomy, the Åland voters are represented only by the Åland Parliament. So there is these two, the power is divided between the parliaments and they never meet. So the Åland representative in the Finnish Parliament has actually, in a formal way, absolutely nothing to do with the Åland Parliament. But of course there are political connections and discussions going on, and the Åland MP in Helsinki often in reality is functioning like an ambassador of the Åland Islands and door opener. But there is no formal connection between these two parliaments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. In terms of your ability to form and manage companies yourselves as a government, can you do so? And if so, where do the profits go?
You mean that the government creates its own companies?
Yes.
Well, of course there is the possibility to do that, but we are very reluctant to take those kind of measures. What has been very beneficial for the whole population of Åland is that we were able in the 1970s to create a slot association that in the modern days have been very successful in creating internet gambling, poker and so on the internet. So, and that company is very vital to our economy today. So it's quite extraordinary, of course, that the small islands has been very successful when it comes to internet gambling. Not something that we are very proud of, but of course it gives us quite a number of employees, 200 here on the islands. And it gives the government last year an income of roughly 20 million euros. So you can understand that it's very important to have that company running.
Is that a privately owned company, or do you have shares in that company as a government?
It's owned by the government. It's formally it was founded by some private organizations dealing with general charity and so on, public life. But in fact, it's governed by our own law, and in that sense by the government, and that's why all the income also comes to our budget.
It would be most interesting to get more detail on that, and the clerks of the committee will write to you asking you a little bit more about that. In terms of the 16 municipalities, do they have rights and abilities in terms of forming companies, or do they not have that power?
The right of municipalities to act when it comes to business is quite restricted by the shall we say, the law on municipalities. You have this general authority for a municipality to act, and you are able to, for example, found a company, but it should be for the use of the public. So you can't create a publicly owned company that is dealing with any kind of commercial matters. Not really. You should then try to produce some sort of general good for the public, not to make money and be a competitor with traditional companies in those fields.
Thank you. You stated earlier that before 1993, your finances, your budget was scrutinised much more by the Finns. I wonder if it would be possible to get some more detail round about the changes that took place at that point to actually allow you more freedom than you had prior to 1993.
The crucial thing is that we got this act, the third one, it took effect on the 1st of January 1993, and the main change through this act was that we got more economical freedom. But because, as Mr. Johnson said, we had to have a budget that was a mini copy of the Finnish budget until 1993. But then we got the right not to decide about the income to our budget, but the right to decide about how to spend the money in the budget.
To allow to spend on your priorities rather than what had previously been Finnish priorities. Would that be fair to say?
Exactly.
Yes.
Because the needs of the Ålanders were not the same as the needs in Finland. For instance, the Finnish economy is to a very great extent depending on forestry, and has been forest industries has been very important. But on the Åland Islands, it's the shipping industry. And our economy on Åland is to a great extent a service-based economy and so on. So that's why this political instrument that the budget is and should be was missing on Åland until 1993.
Thank you very much. Your evidence today has been most useful for the committee. I realise that you have got other business this morning, and we're really grateful for you taking the time out to talk to us today. It may well be that the clerks to the committee will follow up by email with extra points that we may have. But thank you very much. I hope you have a good day there in Åland. Thank you. I now suspend until 10:35 for a change in witnesses. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to welcome our second panel this morning, who are attending in their capacity as members of the Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy in Scotland. They are Councillor David O'Neill, President of COSLA and Chair of the Commission, Councillor Michael Cook, Vice President of COSLA, Professor Richard Kerley, Professor of Management at Queen Margaret University, Louise MacDonald, CEO of Young Scot, and Adam Stewart, Secretariat to the Commission. Councillor O'Neill, would you like to make any opening remarks, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. That red light has just confirmed that I don't need to press any buttons. Someone does that for me. That's good. Very pleased to be back here with other members of the Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy. Our job today is to share an update about the work that we've been undertaking and a flavour of the views and evidence we've received. We have provided you with an advanced copy of our interim report, and I'm sure you will have questions. But before we get started, I will say a few words about where we are and what we've learned so far. Firstly, thank you for inviting us back. We have been working hard since we last saw you, and I'm sure that all the commissioners here today will want to share their perspectives with you. Very pleased that you have begun your inquiry into the flexibility and autonomy of local government. In fact, it's really encouraging that wider thinking about local democracy is now taking place in a number of different places. That's a good thing, and I believe there is space for everyone. As Chair of the Commission, I'm actively trying to work with as many people as possible. That's important because this is a crucial time for democracy. The debate about Scotland's future is becoming ever more hotly contested and passionate, but up to now, much more has been said about decentralisation to Scotland than about decentralisation within Scotland. In our work, it's become clear that people are really interested in another dimension. They are interested in how they can have a stronger say over the decisions that affect them and their communities. Not only that, but it's also becoming clear that local decision-making is also perhaps the best way of improving outcomes. So this Commission has been about local people and communities, and it's about exploring whether a more local approach can transform inequalities and communities. Secondly, we've been working in two phases. The first phase is now drawn to a close and has focused squarely on listening to evidence about local democracy at the moment and what might be achieved in the future. Over the last few months, we've been in an intensive journey. To give a flavour, we have analysed over 200 written responses to our call for evidence, delivered a programme of 13 evidence panel sessions involving 70 witnesses from across Scotland, the UK and Europe, conducted a telephone survey with over 1,000 households and held 5 public listening events with different communities of interest to hear their views firsthand. It's been a mammoth task. Altogether, something like 2,000 people have been directly involved, with thousands of others tuning in. We have webcast all of our evidence sessions. We've used social media, and we've worked with organisations like the University of Edinburgh and Moray to get their expertise. Everything has been made available on our website for scrutiny, and we will continue to apply those principles in future. So, what have we found? Put simply, we've found that local democracy is under pressure. A 50-year centralist trend that has made local democracy large-scale, remote and depowered. It's significantly out of step internationally. This has led to a mindset that hangs on to powers and resources rather than empowers individuals and communities. Part of that has meant that we have tried to fix problems with a top-down approach and a view that big is always beautiful. The whole system is therefore struggling to improve outcomes and inequalities in Scotland because these occur at a very local community level. There's often a worrying them and us culture in the wider framework of democracy, which is leading to a loss of trust, confidence and participation in democracy. The good news, however, is that it doesn't need to be this way. A much more empowering approach is possible, and it's already happening elsewhere in the world. The bad news is that as a country, we have become used to a culture that doesn't empower people locally. So the Commission's conclusion is that if we want to improve outcomes, reduce inequalities, empower citizens and promote participation, then we need a radical new way of thinking. We must reverse the idea that strong democracy consists of the trickle of powers from national government to councils, then to communities, all tightly controlled from above. We need a culture of collaboration rather than existing, often adversarial culture. We need a new ideology where democracy is designed from the bottom up and empowered and has a collective interest in the democratic health of the whole country. In practical terms, that will mean accepting that services can vary in different communities within a system of rights and standards, and that this is a positive consequence of a healthy democracy. It will mean decentralisation geographically, but also decentralisation of powers so that local communities have control over what matters to them. Vitally, it will also mean much more local fiscal empowerment so that real choices can be made locally. Above all, it will mean the confidence to do things differently. For example, we would open our minds to having different systems in different places if that's what local people want. Finally, these are our interim conclusions, and we think they are already far-reaching and require a totally different way of thinking. We know that this might be daunting, but that is the challenge that we are setting out. The next stage is to unpick how this can be put into practice and describe the changes that will need to be made to deliver a radically different system of local democracy. That's critical because strengthening local democracy is an issue for the whole system of government. There will be a new situation in Scotland, and we need to use it to push power down to the lowest possible level. We hope that the committee will get behind that approach and use its influence to help. In the meantime, Chair, very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor O'Neill. Right at the very outset, before the Commission came into being, you yourself were talking about local government's constitutional place. Obviously, we have had the report on local and regional democracy in the United Kingdom from the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe. I think some of that's quoted in your interim report. The rapporteurs there, Angelika Kordfelder of Germany and Alexander Ust of the Russian Federation, said that they were aware of the difficulty of anchoring local self-government in constitutional law, the fact that the UK has no written constitution. While some of our members have been going around Europe the other week, it was emphasised to us the importance of local government's constitutional place. It could be said that in some places, it's there. They don't really need to talk about a huge amount because they know their place. It's written into the Constitution. Your views on local government's constitutional place, where are you at now? Where are the Commission at in that regard?
I think it would be fair to say that the Commission would take the view that there should be constitutional protection for local government. Within my lifetime and within the lifetime of everybody in this room, we saw a whole system of local government being abolished on the whim of a national government. Now, while there's no indication and no suggestion that anybody is thinking that way today, the fact that it did happen in the past, it does mean it could happen again. The fact that there is no written constitution within the UK should not be a bar to having constitutional protection. While the constitution is not written, it does actually exist through custom and practice case law, the establishment of institutions which are there in perpetuity. So it could be done. But I want to emphasise that the work of the Commission is about strengthening local democracy and not merely about embedding local government, whether it's the system that we have just now or some other system. It's about much more than just local government.
Thank you. In terms of strengthening local democracy, one of the things, again, which was emphasised on our trip away was the fact that constitutional place actually came with other guarantees in certain places. For example, in Denmark, the agreement which is written into law is that if any new financial burdens are placed on local authorities by national government, then obviously that money has to flow from national government to local government. Now, in these very austere times where local government is having to deal with the burdens of welfare reform, for example, do you think that that would be of benefit here in Scotland, having that constitutional and legislative protection against such things?
The view of the Commission is that, in this instance, local government does need to be fiscally empowered. That means that there needs to be a far greater ability on the part of local government to raise its own finances and to decide how that's going to be spent. What we have right now is a very centralised system where the vast majority of local government expenditure comes from the centre. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth will tell you that should there be any new burdens placed in local government, that the Scottish Government will finance that. I'm sure if he was sitting here today, he would say that. Our interest, therefore, is in establishing a system which gives more fiscal power, more fiscal autonomy to local government, but having it written within a constitution, or indeed if it's an unwritten constitution, having it in legislation, I think that would be something that we'd be interested in looking at.
Okay. In terms of the interim report, and we're very grateful for you sharing it with us, I understand it's going to be published later on this week. One of the things which it doesn't say is really where you see things going. If you had a blank canvas at this moment in time, how would you establish local government to ensure that local democracy was strengthened?
In part, it is a change of mindset which sees our communities being empowered. It is partly about the compatibility of representative and participative democracy. They are not necessarily the same thing, but they can be compatible. They can be part of the same machine, if you like. We do tend to have a very top-down, centralised structure. Part of the evidence that we received through the surveys that we did, that people felt that the system was centralised both to national government and within local government to the council. People wanted to see the system more decentralised, actually into the heart of the communities, so that there is more participative democracy. And as I say, representative and participative democracy are part of the same solution.
In terms of participation, again, we see from some of our near neighbours that turnouts at elections are much, much higher. In questioning some folks in Germany and Denmark and Sweden, it was very difficult to gauge how participative they were, how they allowed their citizens to actually take part. It just seemed to be the norm, because obviously each citizen sees themselves as having a place, which I think is helped by the constitutional and legislative aspects that they have. I wonder if you have any comments on that. Councillor Cook, I see you indicating.
Yes, I'm happy to really augment some of what David said. I think it's important to understand that we're involved in a process here, as David has explained, so clearly we're not at the point of extrapolating firm conclusions. As we continue our work, that'll happen, and I think that's an important consideration in terms of what we're able to to say to you today. But what we have done is we've looked at historical evidence and we've gathered a vast array of contemporary evidence looking at what the experience is, as you have done across Europe and other parts of the globe. And what we've done is extrapolate a series of themes from that. Now, what becomes clear is that things like local empowerment are critically important to the level of engagement of citizens actively in their political processes. There's a clear correlation between voter turnout and the degree of activism that takes part in communities. We need to understand that relationship and make much more of the kind of relationship that we have. We haven't done that so far. And I suppose what we're coming to the conclusion of, having looked at the evidence, is actually the centralising process which has taken place between essentially the end of the Second War and 1996 is part of the problem here, both for us and for you, as sometimes being perceived as part of the hierarchy of governance in this country, we're all perceived as being too remote from the decisions which are often taken in localities. And actually, in my locality, in David's locality, in all of our localities to some extent, the people who can make the best judgments about those decisions are those who are most firmly planted on the ground and are most locally proximate to those decisions. Now, that's not to suggest for a moment that there isn't an importance to certain decisions being made at other levels. But I suppose what we're aspiring to, and what is embodied in the European Charter, certainly, is something which recognises true subsidiarity. Certainly in terms of our deliberations, we're frequently talking about decentralisation and local empowerment. Actually, in many ways, I think we've got to find the language for this, but I think we're talking about something that's altogether more radical than that. It's not simply decentralisation, which implies always that there is some hierarchy with patronage from the top downwards. We're talking about something that is really fundamental, grows up from the bottom, and you create aggregation within that system depending on the issues that you're dealing with.
You've mentioned empowering local communities, and Councillor O'Neill just said to change the mindset to empower local communities. Can I ask what's preventing that happening right now? Who wants to have a stab at that?
Happy to have a quick observation. To some extent, we're all creatures of the host system. So, in some ways, we are all part of the problem that we're trying to wrestle with here. And I suppose what we're trying to do as a Commission is open our minds to new ideas based on new evidence and try and understand what others are doing which is right and what we're doing wrong. So fundamentally, I think that's what's happening. And I think we recognise happily that it's a process that you're engaged in too.
No real barriers at this moment in time, apart from the fact that we are creatures of habit, would you say?
I mean, one of the obvious barriers is our own temperament to some extent. There's an old adage that no one willingly gives up power. And, you know, I know that that probably is true of me, as I hesitate to suggest this, but it may be true of some MSPs as well.
Councillor O'Neill, and then I'll take Professor Curley.
There is one barrier that I can think of right now, and that's the lack of fiscal empowerment within local government. When we get so much of the money that we spend from central government, while it comes largely in an unring-fenced way, but that does not empower local government. And in terms of participation in democracy, it is a bit much more than voter turnout. But I believe that one of the reasons that we have a problem with voter turnout is that there is a perception within a large part of the public that their vote doesn't really count. Now, we need to address that, and fiscal empowerment of local government would help with that. But it can't stop there. It has to get down into the heart of our communities.
Okay. Professor Curley.
You raised a very complex question, Chairman, and as we were waiting for you, we were observing on television the discussion in Committee Room 2, which is about Portobello, a proposed new Portobello High School on what has long been established to be common good ground. And what I found striking in that was, first of all, defining exactly what the community is, as though it were some neat and tidy expression of opinion. when it seems to me clear from the available evidence that it's not. There's part of the community want a school built, or they want the current school replaced, and they think the best place to put it is on the pre-existing park, and there's another part of the community that don't want anything on that park. And somebody eventually has to make a judgment as between those two choices. It's an interesting contrast between our discussion of both representative democracy and participative democracy about where the balance rests, not as countervailing forces, but in trying to actually get them in sync and working together. The other factor that I would observe is that one of the consequences of centralizing decision-making over time, of a presumption that the centre, whether in Aberdeen or in Edinburgh or in Holyrood, knows best, is that we do over time disempower people. We disempower groups of people, whether professionals. So we've recently seen the teaching workforce complaining about not having enough freedom to implement curriculum for evidence, but at the same time not being given enough guidance to tell them or help them to implement curriculum for evidence. Excellence. We also see that at a neighbourhood level, which is that often there is an expression of view about they, or the council, or MSP should do something about this in many, many different ways. And part of what I think is the cultural difference between us and some other countries, some other societies, is an acceptance of a degree of local self-mobilization as being both legitimate and the appropriate way to tackle some specific local matters, as opposed to a broad general proposition that could be legislated for and provided for countrywide or jurisdiction-wide.
Okay. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Really, it was just to go back on something that was said earlier. It was about we were looking at solutions as to if we had that blank canvas. Being a community development worker to trade, I enjoy hearing all this, but I've been hearing it for a long, long time now about giving more power to communities. What vehicle, now I've read through, but I'm not 100% sure, what vehicle would you be using, or what strategy would you be using to enable to empowering communities?
Who wants to tackle that? Mr. O'Neill.
We haven't worked out the detail of that as yet. We're committed to the principle of it, but I could maybe give some possible examples, and I'll use my own ward as an example. Irvine West, to be specific, is a community of about 25,000 people. Contained within that are a number of community associations who deliver a range of services to the community. If the local authority was to try and deliver those services, it would be a much more costly experience. But the fact that the local communities themselves are empowered to do it, and they decide which services to deliver and how to deliver them within their community centres has a very positive impact. And there are many other examples of not geographical communities, but communities of interest, which could share geographical areas. You could have someone with a particular interest, and I will use as an example someone who is a biker, a motorbiker, has more in common with someone who lives in Glasgow and Edinburgh than they necessarily have in common with the person that lives next door to them, because their interests are totally different, and we should be empowering these groups, whether it's geographically or communities of interest.
Can I just ask then, why are we not doing that just now? What do you think's stopping us just now from doing that?
Well, I think Michael kind of touched on it earlier. There is a mindset that exists about how we handle the money that we currently have. A phraseology that I've used in the past is those in power need to be willing to give up a bit of sovereignty. Michael, I think, would use the word give up some power and see that transferred elsewhere. But there needs to be a desire, a willingness to see some of that sovereignty transferred to the people who can actually make best use of it.
Would we need that in legislation or a constitution? Would we need that to happen legally?
Yes, actually, that touches on the bit that I was seeking to come in on. We're talking about cultural change here. So Richard Curley referred to the different cultural experience across particularly parts of Europe in terms of how people work within a participative and a representative context. Now, I suppose one of the problems that we've got coming here today is that we're not through this process. This is a work in progress. We're still thinking through some of the issues. And I suppose one of those issues that we've been wrestling with very significantly is precisely that question of cultural change. How do you affect that cultural change? You're quite right. There's lots of bold talk about how things need to be bottom up. We've talked about these things for decades, quite honestly, but we've never really broken the back of it. So that's a job of work, I think, for us to focus on. And just to give you an insight into the conversation that is taking place currently, I suppose we're wrestling with this idea as to whether, one extreme, you've got a big bang approach where you have to kind of effect change, perhaps through significant instruction. By its very nature, some of that comes through the top, or you have a more revolutionary approach to it, and actually you set some propositions on the ground and allow a development over the course of time. Now, I think what we're doing is we're wrestling with those extremes and trying to work out where you pitch up on that spectrum of possibility at the present time. So, because we're here somewhat prematurely, I'm afraid it's a slightly unsatisfactory answer, but it's to, I think, reassure you that we're alive to exactly what you're asking about, and it's something that we're very focused on, and we will try and craft, I think, a view that we can agree as a Commission and which offers some tangible and practical way forward in relation to how you affect some of that cultural change.
Louise MacDonald, please.
Yeah, thank you. My kind of background is CLD and youth work as well, so I'm with you in terms of that, and I think in some ways, just reflecting on what Michael has said, is that in some ways this Commission is trying to live what we're talking about, which is being transparent in our thinking, transparent in our process, sharing with people as we go the challenges that we are actually facing. And I think there have been moments in our deliberations where we've heard evidence that have made us stop and rethink, particularly in terms of discussions around equalities and asymmetry and what that actually means, and standardisation, some big, big themes that in some ways have really helped us to really stop and think rather than grasping for a quick kind of, okay, what's the fix? And in some ways, from my kind of CLD background, I love it, but equally we come to kind of situations where people kind of go, well, what does that mean? But I think in some ways we are talking about something quite kind of fundamental rather than a tinkering. I don't think we're there yet in terms of thinking what that is, but it feels to me like with so many others involved in this conversation and the work that you're doing and others are doing, there feels to me like an appetite to be having this conversation. And I suppose it's inherent on all of us to take that as an opportunity to not make it yet another, let's talk about this again and then we'll do it again in 2 or 3 years' time when the next committee is established or the next commission is established. And what was telling for me, and I suppose it would be, but was the session that we did with young people. So we did an evidence session with young people, brought over 80 young people together from very mixed backgrounds, but with a real focus on young people who would not normally kind of connect and engage. But what was clear was how quickly they were able to get into this discussion. It wasn't a really kind of nebulous and difficult thing. For them, it was about equality, fairness, being heard, not playing to stereotypes, being honest, doing what you say you're going to do, listening to everyone. You know, some of these were really sort of basic human fundamentals. So it was really interesting to hear that kind of debate and discussion from them. And I think some of that's been reflected in other places as well. So some of this has been quite kind of fundamental. I've occasionally felt like I've been sitting in a politics lecture, I have to say, when we've had these sort of commission sessions. And in some ways it's been a joy, because actually how often you have that privilege because of where you are, that you are able to listen and hear different voices all the time, and we've had that privilege as well. But how do we kind of make that happen at local level? one of the themes that I think we are also kind of wrestling with is that sense of, at local level and in local government and local councillors, how do they actually become people who empower? We heard one person giving evidence to us, and it's a phrase that sticks with me, who said, how do we make kind of councillors impresarios of empowerment? That actually their kind of role is to empower and actually, you know, recognise that that's the kind of the role in the community. And that's a very strong concept and a really strong ideal, but that requires mind shift. And that's why we are talking about things like mind shift and culture, which feels a wee bit woolly at this point. And I think we're honest and say we need to think about that more.
Can I ask you, Louise, you're not a politician, you're not an academic. You're one of very few women in the Commission. If you had a blank canvas, where would you start from?
I would do what we're doing, which is go out and ask. I think we need to do more listening, and I think what's been the appetite is there. The thing that's been quite shocking, I think, not just for me, for others, has been that us and them, how quickly that has, in the evidence session, that sense of participative and representative, very often feeling like different sides of the coin when actually they are actually something that can work really powerfully together. I think there's something for me about how we actually have that conversation differently. But we do have to challenge some of the kind of structures that are there, you know, in terms of where is the flex, where can we actually do it differently? Is it legislation? Is it just ways of working? Is it working better with what we have? Is it people being brave enough, as Michael's saying, to be the first ones to go and say, do you know what? We don't have legislation, but we'll just go anyway and we're going to give this a shot and see how it kind of works. I think there's a sense of, we can appreciate there's a bit of a big, you know, as Michael said, that's a sense of a big bang, but actually that's not going to help if it comes from on high and suddenly there is a decree that there shall be, when actually what we're saying is what empowers people and ultimately leads to more participation is a sense that actually what you do locally matters and that you have power and influence in your local community. And place, a sense of place, an ability to put down roots because it matters, because you have a say.
You talked about structures. From what you've gathered thus far in your own experience, what structures do you think work and what structures do you think are failing?
I think that for a lot of the evidence that we've kind of heard, and for young people, I think that finding their way into any structure can be difficult. So certainly for some of that sort of sense and understanding of it. So I wouldn't pinpoint one particular. I wouldn't kind of pinpoint one or the other. I think it's a much broader issue about the issue around that sense of whole system. And we talk about in the report we talk about a whole system across all spheres of government. So I don't think it's I wouldn't particularly highlight one. I don't think that's fair.
I think when we talk about a structure, you will find within the report that we say there should not necessarily be a structure, there should be a range of structures. Taking local authorities as an example, while people who live in the centre of any of our large cities and people who live in one of our island communities should have absolutely the same rights, how those rights are delivered in those communities will vary substantially. So we are not looking to have one system, one set of structures that cover the whole of Scotland. We should have a set of structures that suit the communities.
Stuart Stevenson then, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm quite encouraged by what I'm hearing. Let me just give that context. But, and it's not a small but, we're all captured by the language of this funny job we do. And I'm looking at the report, you know, and I sort of think to myself, and by the way, this is self-criticism as well as of others. And I think myself, you know, page 10, heading, the spatial scale and decentralisation of local government. I wonder what that means to the person in the Auchtermuchty High Street. Or fiscal empowerment on page 11. I wonder what that means in Inverurie, you know, etc., etc. And I suspect we've got to get really down to something that talks to people. And that, I'm an iconoclast, I think, in my own party in many respects, in that our councils are far too big. I mean, if I went to Stonehaven and asked people in the street, where is Fogey Loan? I'd be lucky to get one person to tell me that, the answer to that, even though they're both in Aberdeenshire. It has, the convener, as ever, is on the money. So, and I think you capture it very well at theme 4 on page 28, where you're saying you're focusing on local democracy, not local government. But I suspect the two are not separable. However, to the questions, do you think that some of our local authorities are so big it is very difficult in practical terms to create that sense of engagement and involvement, even where councils like Aberdeen have made big efforts to regionalise their decision-making and of local bodies, they nonetheless seem terribly big to people on the ground? Is that part of your thinking that you've got to at this stage?
Who wants to have a crack at that first, David?
I emphasise we're not looking at a structure for Scotland. We're not looking at a structure for local government. What the evidence has shown is that local government in Scotland and in the UK in general is very large compared to others. An example of something that happened in Scotland some years ago when Audit Scotland were conducting their first best value audits. There's two local authorities that spring to mind that were criticised, heavily criticised, for having a very decentralised system of administration. That was Argyll and Bute and Highland Council. Now, anybody who knows Argyll and Bute will know that you could easily split it up into numerous communities, but let's look at the highest level. There's at least 4 separate geographical areas. You've got Helensburgh, which is part of the Central Belt. You've got the island of Bute. You could argue that Dunoon and Bute are very similar in as much as a ferry will get you into the Central Belt. You've got mainland Argyll, you've got the Hebridean Islands, and within those 4 distinct areas, you've got further subdivisions. The headquarters of Argyll and Bute is in Loch Gilphead. Somebody for the Hebridean Islands is unlikely to go to Loch Gilphead for a service. They're more likely to go to Glasgow. But yet they were criticised for having a decentralised system of administration. I think that criticism was unfair and was wrong. Argyll and Bute should at that time and should today be allowed to set up the systems that allow them to deliver to the communities that they represent. And it should not be dictated for the centre how that should be done. So you could get things done in a vastly different way within Argyll and Bute than you will get in Aberdeen. And I know that Aberdeen does have a fairly decentralised system. Shire. Let me go just ever so slightly further. Even within local authorities, you would not necessarily have one system. Give you an example, 2 examples from my own local authority. North Ayrshire has got a population of 138,000. Half the landmass of North Ayrshire is the island of Arran. Arran has got a settled population of about 5,000 people. North Ayrshire does not configure its services in the island of Arran the way that it configures its services in the mainland. We deliver them differently, within the same set of rights and standards. Also in the island of Arran, about 8-9 years ago, we built a new secondary school for 300 pupils. We wouldn't dream of building a secondary school for 300 pupils in the mainland. We'd be building a secondary school a bit like the one we were listening to earlier on for about 1,500 pupils. So you configure your services to suit the communities that you're serving and not some uniform system. That does mean, however, that sometimes the service delivery will look a bit messy. That's not a bad thing.
Thank you. Yes, it's really just an embellishment, I suppose, of much of what David's saying, but rather than extrapolating fully fledged conclusions at this stage, I think what we've got are two key pieces of evidence which respond to the question. What we've got is we've got one piece of evidence which is detailed in the embargoed report you've got around about page 11 and 12. What that begins to demonstrate is that whereas councillors in Scotland cover around 4,300 citizens or something like that, you've then got a graduated system really from France. It's 1 to every 125 through to Denmark at the higher end where it's 1 to 2,000. And certainly there does seem to be a distinct difference in terms of Scottish experience, though that's not markedly different from other experience in the UK, it needs to be said. So there's that one bit of evidence. There's also another piece of contemporary evidence that we've got, which I think is key here, and that is a bit of evidence which says to us as councillors, but says that generally throughout the experience of the governance system in Scotland, that people feel removed from it. They feel remote. And actually, that was the point that you were making in your question. So what we've got, I think, are two critical pieces of evidence there that suggest that the current configuration does give rise to some of the problems that we're wrestling with. And while I don't think we can offer you fully fledged conclusions at this stage, it's clear that we're going to have to look at that and make some judgments there about what we say to you and everyone at large about how these things should be looked at and what future configurations may be. Now, I think there's a trap for us in that. I think there is certainly a risk for the Commission in producing a report which says, for example, in relation to local government, 32 councils is wrong. It should be 76. There's an obvious trap in that then becomes the thing that catches the eye, and we end up with a dialogue that is purely about that kind of issue. And this is a much more fundamental conversation than that. As David has rightly said and emphasised throughout the discussion thus far, this is not simply about local government. This is about a whole system approach and looking at the whole context in which we operate in Scotland and how we should do it differently.
Can I just try and capture that in a wee pithy phrase? Perhaps the thing that we constantly hear, that there's too many politicians, is actually caused by us not having enough.
Well, it would be rash of me to agree with that. So, but it's certainly an observation which there seems to be some succor for, given the experience in other parts of Europe, where people appear to feel more comfortable with many more representatives because there seems to be some payoff in terms of local empowerment and the feeling of being involved.
You wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I'll address myself not to the last remark, Mr. Stevenson, but your earlier question. I think it's very difficult to answer a question, are some councils too big? Because it depends on what criteria you're making a judgment. It's often observed that what we have tried to do, that there have been changes over the past 20 or 30 years, is squeeze very diverse aspects of service provision and reach into one common body. So refuse collection, for example, is a very local activity that requires a map. It's now done electronically, but a mapping exercise about where we collect from and how much. Refuse disposal or recycling tends by its nature to be a much larger scale activity. And it's problematic if you have an aggregation of different local authorities to do that. It also turns upon geography. With the exception possibly of Broughty Ferry in Dundee and West Hill in Aberdeen and Queen's Ferry maybe in Edinburgh, the cities are not generally, if you ask people, are not viewed as particularly big. It's easily possible for people to travel across a city, to relate to different parts of a city. Highland is an enormous area. So if you wanted me to speculate in relation to an earlier question about blank canvas, it might be that our enthusiasm for having unitary authorities back in the 90s was mistaken in relation to those far more widely dispersed and sparsely populated areas. But the other factor in relation to scale is that small is not necessarily marvellous. France has some, nobody can actually itemize in detail the number, about 36,000 different communes. vast numbers of councillors. But the reality in many of those smaller communes is it's the mayor you pay attention to. Sarkozy, Hollande, immaterial. Get on the wrong side of the mayor in some small French villages and towns, and you might as well leave town. Because you're not going to get a planning consent, you're not going to get approval for your bar to open or extend, you're not even going to get rubbish collected properly if you upset the man, usually as a man convener, who is the mayor of that particular town. So scale is a very problematic one to address. I'd close by saying that part of the spirit that might emerge from what we're saying here is that actually we should throw some of that discussion back into defined groups of communities. If there is a view that there is the wrong number of councils in Scotland, then it probably might not be for this Parliament to determine what the right number is, but to enable a discussion at given areas to say, how many councils do we think appropriate? Do we think Renfrewshire should be 1, but Highland should be 20? Your judgment might not be as effective in terms of encouraging engagement as might be the local discussion that flows through discussion and participation into ultimately some kind of legislation.
Stuart, you want to come back in? For the record, Aberdeenshire, not an Aberdeen city, by the way.
Indeed.
Apologies.
I think we've just heard of what I would refer as the Cloche-Merrill effect. Those of a certain age will know what I'm yes, some of us do.
There's not of a certain age?
No. Later, no time. I did just want to, given that your focus is democracy, but powers are necessarily part of that discussion, in the context of Scotland acquiring the full range of powers, there are some which it strikes me, if they leave Westminster, should bypass this Parliament and go straight to local authorities. And I'm thinking in particular of powers in the area of social security, perhaps the delivery of health, frankly. I'm not sure Parliament's the best place. And indeed, some of the powers in relation to employment. Now, that's my view, and that's neither here nor there. I'm just wondering to what extent, in the context of whatever the outcome of the vote, because there are suggestions, whatever the outcome, there will be additional powers. I'm sceptical in the no, but that doesn't matter. Have you looked at what powers might usefully bypass the Scottish Parliament? Because I don't think there is anyone here who actually thinks the Parliament should get bigger numerically, and hence if there are more powers will need to bypass the Parliament or be sent to other places in the democratic system. And to what extent are you looking at that?
Can I say before, just going back to Richard's comments about France, that was an observation and not a recommendation. Should powers bypass the Parliament and go straight to local authorities? Again, I will use my own local authority as an example. Ballpark figure, North Ayrshire's budget is about £430-ish million a year. The DWP spends a not dissimilar amount of money within North Ayrshire, but yet there is no joined up approach to that. And should there be, we sought evidence on how that should happen, and the evidence come back, they basically said yes, there should be a joined up approach to that. I am less cynical than yourself about the transfer of powers, irrespective of the outcome. I mean, we already have legislation in place in, I think it's 2016, there's additional powers, but there should be more comes thereafter. And power should be at the most appropriate level. Sometimes it will be appropriate for things to be at community level, sometimes it will be appropriate to be at local authority level, sometimes it will be appropriate at national level. Let me just go back a wee bit to what part of the motivation was for setting up the Commission. Since the end of the Second World War, when we did see this trend towards centralisation, we have saw massive improvements in the health of the citizens of the United Kingdom, in terms of the wealth of the citizens of the United Kingdom. But the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom has actually grown wider, to the extent that within, again using my own council, the shortest life expectancy and the longest life expectancy in North Ayrshire, the difference is 24 years for communities 2.5 miles apart. That's not acceptable in a modern, developed Western democracy, that we have that type of difference. Within our inner cities, you can have that type of gap in life expectancy. Just be living around the corner, being in a street which has got considerable wealth compared to a street that's got considerable deprivation. So that's the motivation for doing something differently from what we are currently doing, because what we're currently doing right now doesn't work.
Thank you. Obviously, we're a non-partisan commission, so it's difficult for us to make value judgments or at least express them, notwithstanding some of the strong views that some of us might have. But we've talked about asymmetry in relation to the democratic model or the governance model that we've highlighted this morning and is referred to in the report. And also, I think, I hate to use the word asymmetry in relation to your earlier point about jargon, and it's something that we're alive to. I think we need to deal with that. But actually, there's no reason why we're not talking here, and indeed we are talking about asymmetry of powers and potentially service provision. So it's very easy, I think, straight away to see examples of that. David gave the polar opposite examples earlier of experience perhaps in the city of Glasgow compared to that in Orkney. Now, there are certain things that you may want in terms of direct economic empowerment in relation to some form of authority in Glasgow, which may not be the same in Orkney. But in Orkney, as you'll see from the Islands Commission, they may want certain powers in relation to shoreline and coast, etc., which is already a hot topic for them. So I think you can see potentially a kind of development there which would recognise real difference. And between those polar opposites, we've got to recognise there are very many different communities across Scotland. They're all diverse. And I think fundamentally what we're talking about, we had another piece of jargon at the conference which we talked about as differential democracy. And I have to say it's something that made me cringe rather. It sounds terrible, differential democracy. But what it means fundamentally is different people with different circumstances having different arrangements. It's no more complicated than that. And actually, I suspect as a general principle, that's something that we can all sign up to.
Thank you, Convener. And I have to say that while I don't have a fixed position as such, I think that the trip that we undertook to Germany, Denmark and Sweden certainly highlighted the difference in size and scale when it comes to the delivery of local democracy in these places, and also that there's a differential even within these countries as well, and we shouldn't just assume that because there are large numbers of municipalities or councils that they all have to conform to a similar size. And I think that's perhaps the point that Professor Curley was making around the difference between, for example, Highland and Aberdeen City in terms of what is there, or even looking at having Inverness contained within the Highland area as an example. I wonder a couple of issues that I wanted to pick up on. The first was that we often hear conflicting complaint, and it's often conflicting complaint that comes from the very same voices, that on the one hand there is an aspiration for there to be much greater flexibility and freedom for delivery of local services, for delivery of local priorities, and yet at the same time there are complaints about what is perceived to be a postcode lottery, where certain areas deliver things differently and achieve different outcomes, and that is somehow seen as a problem rather than a celebration of diversity and local freedom in decision-making. Do you think that's part of the mindset culture that we need to get beyond, is this idea that we want freedom and flexibility, yet at the same time we want uniformity?
I earlier used the word messy, You know, if you don't do things the same everywhere, that looks messy, and some people would say that that's a bad thing. I don't think it is a bad thing. Looking messy can actually be a strength. It's doing things in the appropriate way that suits community. But that doesn't mean that there has to be a different set of standards. Standards should be national. For example, everyone has the right to expect a warm, dry house. That should be a national standard, and what those standards are should be set nationally, and how it gets delivered locally, where the houses go, etc., should be a matter for local determination. Part of the evidence that we got from a disability rights group that there is a concern from people with disabilities that when they currently move from one local authority area to another, that the packages that are available to them, the financial packages, vary, and that means that they are disadvantaged. They don't have the ability to go from one community, one geographical community to another, because they might lose out on that. And there are things like that that certainly should be, there should be a set of standards that apply across the board. But I don't think that we should think messy is a weakness. Messy could actually be a strength within our communities.
Michael?
Yeah, you just to add to that again, I mean, I think in terms of our current thinking, obviously we envisage a framework which protects basic rights and standards for citizens. So that is the kind of thing that you want to expect, that you would expect to exist nationwide. And I think we've been very sensitive, as David explains, to some groups that have made particular representations about that based on anxieties that they have. And the postcode lottery is frequently the description which is given to the problem that's experienced there. But I think we need to accept that while fundamental rights are something which should be preserved broadly, there is a matter of local decision-making here which can be expressed in different terms. And it goes back to the idea of asymmetry, to use the jargon again. It's the idea that in my locality, people can genuinely choose where it's not a matter of a national service provision or something of that nature. It's a matter of local determination how service provision should be configured. And what level, for example, in relation to local taxation, they should be taxed. That kind of thing. The view in David's area may be completely different about it. Now, that is legitimate difference, and that shouldn't be cohered within some kind of national structure. It's the rights and the standards that people should expect, which should be protected, not those matters of choice. If we want to empower them locally, we've got to allow them to experience different choices and make fundamentally different choices.
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that, a lot of the discussion that we had around where postcode lottery was talked about was in relation to the equalities kind of piece. And I think what was interesting is a lot of the fear around that came from that sense of actually not being part of the decision making. It comes back to a feeling of being done to, that decisions are made elsewhere, or they're not actually kind of people feeling part of that. So back to jargon, but it's the dreaded, the dreaded co-production word, but actually no decision about us without us. That kind of standard kind of rallying call came through a lot, and there was a sense of a lack of trust that actually locally that would happen, because there was a fear about postcode lottery, and that kind of came through, although I think there's a wee bit of a health warning on that, how that language is used sometimes. But so that it's tied to that fear is tied to that sense of disempowerment and not feeling that they're actually part of decision making. Whereas actually what we're kind of saying is that if you move beyond compliance-led and box ticking for kind of equalities and actually make it about involving people, then that can be part of that kind of vibrant local democratic kind of structures and local service delivery as well.
Okay. Mark, do you want to come back?
Yeah. Obviously, and I appreciate that the Commission is not simply looking at local government, and I realise that we can sometimes fall into the trap of solely focusing on the role of local government, the role of local authorities. But there's also obviously how do we ensure that the people feed into the the decision-making process, and how do they feel? How do we empower them? And I wonder, one of the things which we discussed when we were in Malmo was they have what they call a citizens panel that is set up. And while it has what you would probably determine as some of the usual suspects in terms of people who would put themselves forward for community councils, other forms of civic participation, they also select people via a process where they filter for ensuring that there's a balance of gender, of ethnicity, of age from within the population, and these people are invited to join the citizens panel alongside those who have put themselves forward. And I wonder if that's something that you've looked at in terms of, because we often talk about civic participation and we talk about how do we get communities involved, and often, and I'm not denigrating the work that they do, because in many places they do a fantastic job, but often community councils and community groups are simply the same faces with different hats. And how do we encourage that wider participation within society, so that we're not just talking to a very small, often self-selected group who haven't had to put themselves forward to their communities to be elected to represent them or anything like that. Have you looked into that in some detail in terms of how we encourage that wider participation and break through some of the apathy that exists within communities?
Adam, you look keen to answer that.
Yeah, I think I can say a little bit about that. In terms of the process, yes, very much that's come across in most of the evidence sessions that we've held with a whole variety of groups, including many people who are actual activists in the community themselves, who would recognise that there are issues around about the representativeness of the voices of the wider community. And so that's something that we've been actively trying to explore, and we say a little bit about that in the interim report, round about the options for deliberative consultations. You mentioned one in Malmo, there's others that are often quoted in Sao Paulo and places like that. And really the concept there is about a much more active way of engaging with communities and allowing them to make very active and empowered decisions over quite substantial elements of policy making or budgets. It's something that we intend to do some further research on for the second phase of our work, and we're working with the University of Edinburgh on some of those options at the moment, and I think it's likely that some of those will be reflected in the second stage of our conclusions.
You raised something really, really important and very hard to produce an instant. Well, we don't have an instant solution, but I think we do need to grapple with precisely that kind of challenge. I wouldn't discount the value of those usual suspects. On a wet Thursday night in February, when there's a Champions League game and a great bit of tennis on television or a great bit of drama, it's the 2 or 3 people who are willing to turn out and keep things ticking over, who sometimes sustain the life of such participative organizations through the ups and downs that invariably arise when you're trying to maintain that kind of that level of engagement. I would suggest there are 2 or 3 different aspects to this. The first is that we need to show through our actions, whether in decision-making bodies of whatever kind, whether it's a local authority or a parliamentary committee or a parliamentary body, that the engagement that people demonstrate and the ideas that they generate through that are treated seriously and in a considered way, so that people don't walk into a meeting with councillors or council officials or MSPs with the implicit assumption that, well, you've already made your minds up anyway. So what's the point of us saying this? I would argue that requires formal bodies to actually be a lot clearer about what kind of process of discussion they're engaging in. We often elide and confuse the terms participation, negotiation, and communication in very, very unhelpful ways. And it is frequently the case that I'll hear on the television or radio or read in the paper, they said they wanted to consult us, but they ignored our views. As though consultation implied that whatever you come up with, those of us who make decisions, whether you or these 2 people here, are going to say, fine, that's it. There needs to be a far more nuanced and subtle process that is about considered engagement from, and I don't like to use the term both sides, but from the different sides of the angle. The second point is that you can generate serious engagement across a range of people if you are consistent in doing that. A number of local authorities have shown, and I think those where there is a very lively engagement by community councils with the decision-making by health boards and by councils have shown that this can be done. If you encourage people to engage and comment and discuss and grapple with issues, treat it seriously, respond to it in a way that shows respect, then you can encourage people to build more and more of their engagement. That's about the cultural change that I think Michael and others of us referred to. It's a long slog. You don't turn around a command economy in 3 weeks. It takes months, if not years, to do that.
Louise, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways, just reflecting on, we had a specific evidence session on this topic, and it's available to kind of watch again. All of the evidence sessions are available to watch, but it's one that I think in particular has kind of stuck with me, because in some ways where we were challenged was actually even taking it beyond what Richard was saying. Because that listening and that engagement, and there are some fantastic examples, absolutely, there's some great work going on across the piece. But if that then doesn't come with power, if that then doesn't come with a sense of owning anything, even in the sense where there's a community group or whatever being asked to look after a particular thing, it's always a sense of it's temporary. It's never a wholly trusting, a wholly kind of, we are part of this together. Am I making that clear?
Because you're talking about power.
Yeah.
Does power actually, in most cases, mean resources? Money?
No, not always. Not always. I don't think so. I don't think that's what people were kind of talking about. I think in terms of the examples, some of the examples that we were kind of hearing was that sense of, if it's always done on a kind of paternalistic, temporary basis, that you're part of that decision-making rather than feeling wholly part of it, and which is why I think that's where the challenge is. That's when we start to talk about mindsets and culture and moving beyond consultation. And I think there are lots of people talking about this. I mean, today, the co-production conference is happening, and there's people coming from all over Scotland debating this in the health service about how these very issues, about how do you do that. So these are not themes that are sitting in one place just about local government. But I think that point about taking it beyond, we've heard you and we will go off and make a decision, which is sometimes how it can feel. How do you move it beyond that? And that's the question that people have been asking.
Art?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the difficulties that's often faced is that people will become activated by an issue that directly affects them. And I've experienced this when I was a local councillor, and that people would come along to a community council meeting week after week until the issue they wanted resolved was resolved, and then would disappear and would never be seen again. But I wonder whether we've worked out yet what the best vehicle for public interaction with, be it local authorities, be it government, be it other agencies, if we've worked out what the best vehicle for that is, because in some communities there are no community councils, either because the desire to establish one is not there, or the people who were on it have all left it and nobody's come in to take it over. So in some of these communities we have no sort of statutory consultation body with local authorities, because community councils are that statutory body that the local authority has to consult with on issues around planning and other matters. So have we looked at whether that situation is as good as it could be? I suspect the answer is no. And if not, are there different ways that we could be doing things to encourage that kind of community participation?
David?
If I could just very briefly go back to your question, Chair, about power, is that about resource? No, not necessarily. A planning application is a good example of that. I want this to happen. I don't want this to happen. There is power involved in taking that decision, and you will inevitably please someone and upset someone else. In terms of the vehicle that exists, there are vehicles exist. Are they good enough? They are probably not as widespread as they should be. Some local authorities are very good at participative budgeting. some are less good at it. Some are good involving the usual suspects and going no further than that. Some do go much further than that. Again, I will use my own authority as an example, where we have the People's Panel, which is 2,000 individuals who are not chosen at random. They are selected on a scientific basis to give you a spread of gender, age, etc., etc. Half of them come from areas that have high levels of deprivation, the other half don't, and there are many authorities that have that type of system in place. Also in North Ayrshire, once at the beginning of every term, we do a household survey where a very detailed questionnaire goes out. The level of return that comes back, statistically speaking, makes it a very useful piece of work, and many authorities do that. We don't all do it. Those that there is certainly a case for picking up the best practice from elsewhere and rolling that out. But there will be more than one way of doing it.
Matt, I mean, I'm aware of local authorities who do these household surveys, things like that. I think where the public maybe disengage is that they don't see the follow through, and they don't feel that they're involved beyond the point that they get asked all these questions by the local authority. They don't then feel they're involved beyond that sometimes, and that's it's having people involved. I mean, you can't have them in the room taking the vote, for example. But do they need to be looking at involving the public or the people more throughout the decision-making process up to the point of the decision, rather than maybe having them involved at the beginning, and then they often feel that they're excluded from that point onwards?
Do you want to come back briefly, David? Because I want to take Michael in as well, please.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't resist in coming in on the question of activism as a result of what takes place on the ground. I'm somebody actually I'm a councillor, and I got involved in this because I was fighting against the threatened closure of a local swimming pool. So my entire experience is born out of that individual experience. And I suppose the question I continually ask myself is, why the hell did I get involved in all this? As perhaps you do yourself sometimes. And I suppose the reason I got involved is because I genuinely believed it was possible to influence things and affect change. Now, in a way, I think that describes in a nutshell the process that we've got to create as the cornerstone of what we're about here. There are elements of process in this, and there are elements of culture in this, as we've described earlier, but we need to give people that belief that actually their views count, that they can influence things, their perspectives will make a difference, and if we can begin to get those things right, that suggests, on the evidence of experience from other countries, that people will become more engaged in the participative side of things, but they are also more likely to be active in the representative side as well. There's a clear correlation between these things. So, again, today, I don't think we have fully formed conclusions to offer up to you, but I think what we can say is, using the theme of asymmetry again, that there are potentially, as David described it, all sorts of vehicles out there to ensure that people get engaged. There is a bit of this, to come back to the Chairman's question, about resourcing, and is it really about resources? Yes, some of it's about resources, but it's about more than just resources. It's about a belief in making a difference, and it's about believing actually that your view counts. If you believe your view counts, you will take part. That is the nature of things. And we need to build a culture which recognises that across the board. Now, the question, as we articulated earlier, that we're wrestling with is how much of that culture change you can affect by soft processes and how much you need to affect by hard change. And we're still thinking about that.
Tom Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to make a slight declaration here in terms of, I have been an elected member at local government level twice in two different authorities. My wife is currently an independent councillor in a local authority, I'm also the chair of a local community organisation which took on the lease of a community facility from a local authority, and today opened up the running of the local post office services in the village that I live in. So I'm very well aware of the differences in terms of the decision-making process and where people can engage and should engage. And like Louise, I did come from a community development background, and Arnstein's ladder is one of these things that's embedded in the brain to remind us about participation. But we've been fortunate in this committee. We have just carried out over the last 2 years our investigation leading up to the major report we produced on community empowerment in relation to the proposed community empowerment legislation coming forward by the Scottish Government. And certainly we identified in that report that there's a number of areas where local government currently claims to be engaged with communities in the decision-making process that seem to be failing. And one of those organisations or bodies that was established was community planning partnerships, where we were all convinced, and it's been since New Life for Urban Scotland in 1988, same time as the subsidiarity document came from the EU, that we could believe that communities could become engaged in the decision-making at a local level through the community planning process. What is different? Why do you feel we've now come to the stage where we need to start talking about strengthening local democracy when we've had all these various structures imposed either by national government, local government, that we're now in a situation where you feel we need to strengthen local democracy in the way that you're presented in your paper?
David?
When I spoke earlier about the motivation for setting up the Commission for Local Democracy, and I used the example of the difference of life expectancy. Now, there's many other things. For example, if someone lives in a deprived community, not only is their life expectancy going to be less, but their general health throughout their lifetime will be less. They are more likely to be victims of crime. They are more likely to live in poor housing conditions, etc., etc., etc. Over the course, and people want to talk about the last 50, 60 years, but it does probably go back to the Second World War. We have seen these gaps get wider and wider. We have seen the move towards centralisation become embedded within the mindset of the people who actually take the decisions on these things. Community planning.
Can you just clarify about the centralisation and the mindset of the people making the decisions? Because I think that's fundamental to talking about local democracy. If we're talking about the mindsets of the decision makers and the centralisation of the decisions, where are we talking about that centralisation taking place? Because is it UK government level, is it Scottish government level, or as I could argue and give examples of, local authority level?
All of those. See, if I take you to page 12 on the report, and this is a chart which is specifically about local authorities. Up to 1975, there were 4 cities, 33 counties, 21 large boroughs, 176 small boroughs, and 196 district councils. We now have 32, so local government is in itself a bad example of where that centralisation has taken place. If you look at health boards, now I don't know how many health boards there used to be. We're down to, I think it's 14 currently within the UK. My memory, if it serves me right, when Ayrshire and Arran had health trusts, there were initially 5 trusts, now down to one health board. So this isn't something that is peculiar to one government, to one party. It's been a culture that has existed in the UK. And I would have to say that people, in all honesty, thought they were doing the right thing. But when you sit down and look at the evidence today, it hasn't delivered what we wanted it to deliver, and the gaps have indeed increased. They have gone in the wrong direction, and if we want to do something about that inequality in health and wealth, we cannot achieve the changes that we need by doing what we have always done. We need to do something different, and all the evidence that we have is doing it from a community level up the way has a far better outcome for communities than the top-down approach that the UK, Scotland and local authorities have adopted over the last 50 or 60 years.
Michael?
Yeah, there's a slight risk of us getting into the realms of speculation as individuals who are part of the Commission here, so I think there's a slight risk for us in this. But in terms of the concept which sits behind community planning, I don't imagine that any of us bridle at the proposition that public sector and other partners, whether in the voluntary sector or the private sector, should act collectively in the interests of their communities. In order to do that, they need to understand their communities. They need to understand place. They need to understand what's going on, a kind of process that David described earlier. So I think we're all comfortable with that idea. If I was to indulge in a bit of speculation, however, part of the problem here has been one of timescale, certainly. So the community planning process has been an iterative process where actually we've been learning certain things as we go along, and we've come across certain pitfalls in the process, I suppose, as it has developed. The other obvious issue with it is a question of scale. Often you're talking about community planning partnerships which are organised at fairly substantial scale. And I think we haven't yet cracked the real local dimension of community planning partnerships. Now, I can say to you quite directly, in my own council, I'm very active in thinking about these processes and discussing them with officers. So we have a series of devolved entities in, as it were, the 5 local areas which sit within what is the 6th largest geographic local authority in Scotland. And we are thinking about how we really penetrate communities. Part of what I wanted to do is ensure that we create community planning models which exist at the very lowest level. So we're talking about settlement community planning models almost, and how we develop that. Now again, these things are, some of these will take place in councils just thinking about it and setting a process off by their own lights, determining that that's the way they should move forward. But I think there has been an issue up to this juncture about scale and the level at which we're organised, and I think that's something that we need to address. Now, again, I think we're at slight risk here. You catch us still part-way through the process, and I think we've got to develop our thinking about these things. But I think we'll refine this and hopefully be able to come back to you and I think give a more fully fledged answer to your question.
Thank you very much. And I'd say to Councillor O'Neill, I've lived through 3 major changes in local government. 1974, 75, the change that took place there by a UK government imposing local government structures in Scotland. In 1995-6, once again, changes to local government structures placed and imposed on us by a UK government who, in the main, some would argue, were not happy at the lead that was being taken by 2 leading regional councils in Scotland, Lothians and Strathclyde, against the drive in terms of welfare reform that was taking place from the UK government during that period. So you can actually say, I can analyse those changes taking place in terms of the democratisation, if I can say that word, of local government, because of fears from central government in relation to the power or perceived power that local government had in those areas. But interestingly, the 2007 change in terms of local government, which is one that we don't tend to talk about too much, and that was the introduction of a form of proportional representation in local government, which changed the face in many local authorities throughout Scotland in terms of the representation or the elected members and the structures. Because one of the issues that we look at when you compare some of the European local government structures is that we don't have the situation where you either have one leading party in power of a local authority or a coalition of 2 parties. In Denmark, the example is usually 4 or 5 parties form a coalition, and Professor Kerley might correct me on this one, 4 or 5 parties form coalition in local government, and people vote, and it's argued that people vote because they feel when they participate in the voting process, whoever they vote for may actually have a bigger impact on the decisions that that local authority makes, rather than at the present moment, where many people have become disenfranchised because they feel their vote doesn't count when it comes to local government. Particularly when you look at, and go back to your example, Councillor O'Neill, where you're actually talking about deprived communities. And some of the analysis that we've seen over recent local government elections is some of the most deprived areas in Scotland are polling 20%. People are actually turning up, and there's only 20%. And that, and when you analyse that even further, is based on only 80% of the population being registered to vote in these areas. And there's 20% of the population not registered to vote, and you're getting 20% turnouts at the polling stations during local government, despite all the efforts and all the work that's supposed to have been done by central government and local government to tackle areas of multiple deprivation in Scotland. How do we get to increase local democracy? Because we know, and Professor Kerley gave an example previously, in a middle-class area in the suburbs of Edinburgh, probably get better services than the people living in the most deprived areas of Edinburgh, just by virtue of their voice and the way they can articulate themselves. How do we ensure that we get the people in deprived areas to participate in the process and increasing their role within local democracy in Scotland?
Professor Kerley.
Yeah, you raised some really fundamental questions, Mr. Wilson, that some of which are quite hard to address in the context of our assumptions and the discussion we've had in the Commission. I was one of the people blamed for or responsible for moving towards the single transferable vote system. Indeed, one member of the Labour Party once said to me, "You elected more bloody SNP councillors than Alex Salmond ever did," which I took with a pinch of salt. I was engaged in that because I thought that that change of system was appropriate for our local government. The interesting contrast is that in a number of the countries that you have looked at, and visited on some occasions, the form of representation you find in local government is based on a list form of election, which removes, to all intents and purposes, the notion of somebody having a representative. I've had discussions about this in the Netherlands, actually, with councillors, and asked them, well, if I lived in Prinsengracht and I wasn't happy with refuse collection, which councillor would I speak to? And these were men and women who were committed and engaged, and they looked at each other and looked at me and said, well, why would you want to do that? And I said, well, because that's what I would do in my city. And they said, no, we don't do that. You would speak to the officials, you would speak to the Burgermeister responsible for that function. You wouldn't assume that there was a local territorial engagement, one man or woman you could speak to. The second aspect to my comment and response on that is that we, in the United Kingdom generally, we are less disposed to vote in every election than in many other countries. You will know this from your experience. Had Alex Rowley been here, he was elected on, a turnout of 30-odd% in the by-election in Fife. Many of you have turnouts, if you're a constituency representative, of 50+ or something like that. Curiously, and I don't understand why, I've not had any satisfactory answer, the highest level of electoral engagement we have in the United Kingdom as at the present is in Northern Ireland, where a turnout of about 60% is not unusual, in one of the weakest local government systems in northwestern Europe, certainly the weakest local government system within the United Kingdom, yet high 50s, 60% of people turn out to vote. That's socially differentiated as well as it is in every country. And what you can see in Denmark and Germany is turnouts of 30% in areas which are fragile, marginal, transient, high levels of turnover and low levels of income. But part of what we're trying to get at here in this work is to see voting for representative bodies as being one aspect of local democracy. It's not the only one. There are other vehicles. There's a variety of forms of citizen engagement. I would love to see 80% of people voting as they have in Italy, or 60%. You know, they've bemoaned in France that only 62% of the electorate turned out to vote the other week. We'd be delighted with that figure in local government, and that would be a healthy sign, but it's not just achieved without a lot of other change and engagement at many different levels. As others have said, when people think that they can impact on what we're doing, what public bodies are doing, then they are more inclined to vote. Final point, Chairman, I know you're conscious of time. The solution is not a retro solution. Back in the 1960s, early 70s, we had dismal levels of electoral turnout. There were at least 2 or 3 county council elections that I've looked at the records for where literally there were no elections. Kincardineshire had no elections in 1 year. Berwickshire had no elections in 1 year because there was no contest. A few years ago, and if you can think back to 74, 75, Mr. Wilson, you may well have met councillors who, as one said to me, I've never fought an election. Good God, I've just been nominated. And that was it. So we didn't have a golden age that we could return to.
Convener, it's just one final point I was wanting to make, and that was the issue that this work, and commendable as it is not been done in a vacuum. There are other things taking place. We've now got a good example of consultation, how not to do, in my view, how not to do consultation is the Scottish Local Government Boundary Commission, who set out their consultation on councillor numbers for local authorities in 2016. And they started off that process by giving the numbers of councillors they expected for every local authority in 2016. And and that was before they even engaged in conversations with the local authorities themselves. And I think it is about how we consult and what we mean by consultation that really will be the changing factor in terms of increasing participation in local democracy at all levels. And I think that, as I said, the report has been useful. The work these are doing is extremely useful, and hopefully we can engage in future discussions about taking this forward, not only from the local government perspective and the Commission's perspective, but also hopefully from the Scottish Parliament's perspective about what we see as being true democracy in Scotland.
That was a statement rather than a question. So, Stuart Stevenson.
This is just a tiny statement to Professor Carley. There have been parliamentary elections in the last 100 years, more than one, where there's also been unopposed returns.
I don't recall those.
Oh, no, I can give you them if you like.
You can have those discussions afterwards. Cameron Buchanan, please.
Sorry, can I just ask, I have 2 questions. The single transferable vote has not, in local government, been seen as a success. People always want to know who their councillor is, and they find it very difficult to say there's just one councillor for it. And the other point I was going to make was, what's your next step? There's no pound signs in this thing. What is your next step from this document?
Single transferable vote is not universally popular within local government.
Not at all. Not at all.
Why do we have one system of election for local government across Scotland? An example, if I stand in the middle of my ward in Irvine and walk half an hour in any direction, I'll get to the edge of the ward. Michael couldn't drive about his ward in a day. Mind his car's a wreck. That's maybe got something to do with it. But the size of the ward is so vastly different. To have a system of single transferable vote imposed in a rural community and equally imposed in an urban community doesn't work. What's the pound signs? We haven't put pound signs on it because what we have deliberately avoided doing was looking at a change in structure which would involve pound signs, and we haven't done that.
Thank you
very much. Can I ask one final question? And that is, when do you hope to conclude your work? When are we going to see the full report rather than the interim?
Well, Adam can give some detail on that.
Yeah, I think over the next couple of months what we want to do is reflect on all the evidence we've heard so far, and we'll be looking through some options papers for each of the key themes that you see in the report, the 4 key themes that are set out. Probably by June we will have done the work through the Commission to look at those options with some period of write-up thereafter, so certainly by the end of the summer we hope to have that concluded.
So publication of the full report end of summer?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your time and your evidence today. I now suspend and we move into private session.